Hello and welcome everyone to the GLA Compliance Audit Briefing for the year 2023 to 2024. I'll just give you a quick introduction to our team. So we've got John Walsh, who's the Compliance Audit Lead for the North East Area team. Got myself, Phoebe Fraser, who's the Compliance Audit Lead for the South Area team, and Becca Antink, the Area Lead, Compliance Audit Area Lead for the North West team. Assisting on this work is Maria Madi in the CA London team, who also works closely with Nerida Devane, who is the CA London team lead. So today we're going to be covering the rationale and approach for the compliance audit. We'll then be having a look at the headlines of this year's audit. We'll run through the indicative timetable and an explanation of our checklists. Then we'll take a look at the templates that we've got available for this year. And finally, we'll have a look at best practice examples. And I'll just hand over to Becca now to take us through rationale and approach.
Thanks, Phoebe, and hi, everyone. So I'll go over the rationale and approach for our compliance audits to start off with. So the key thing that the compliance audit is all about is ensuring that the GLA's policies, funding conditions and procedures have been correctly followed. So we ask that providers commission an independent audit based on our audit checklists and a random sample of completed schemes, which then inform the GLA assessment and ratings for that year. The checklist we'll cover in a bit more detail later, but can all be found in section 9 of the Capital Funding Guide on the london.gov.uk website. And it's also worth noting that London does continue to operate its own design standards. So although many aspects were aligned with national standards in 2015 and 2016, the most up-to-date GLA document is the new London plan, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So next slide, please. In terms of the headlines for 23 to 24, we are looking again, as always, at a 10% sample of the completed schemes. So this year that equates to 182 schemes being selected for audit across 66 developing organisations. That includes 34 RSAP projects, which is more than we've had previously, 6 cladding schemes across 4 providers. And you may well have noticed that due to the volume of delivery in 22 to 23, although the 10% sample is the same as always, the actual number of schemes being audited is higher because of that higher amount of delivery in the final year of our previous programme. The sample includes cash and RSAP homes, and providers are asked to ensure that auditors they make sure that they're aware of the requirements and the checklist for those different schemes as soon as they receive instructions from the GLA. We are again accepting virtual audits this year and have also extended the timetable for providing a sample to investment partners so that there's more time to prepare those files in advance of the audit, which will be covered in a bit more detail later on in the presentation. And we do ask that auditors are given read-only access by providers on OPS. So if we could, yes, go to the next slide where we have a look at the headlines from 21 to 22. So if we could just go back to the 21-22 headlines. The majority of partners in 21-22, which is the sort of the last year where we've got all of the audit details finalised. The majority of partners received a green rating, which was great. 8 partners received an amber rating, which was a bit of an increase on the previous year, and 1 red rating was recorded, which was the same as the previous year. So in terms of what those ratings actually mean, green ratings are where there are minor or in some cases low level of moderate breaches of funding conditions, and that will be noted in the overall grading and comments. Amber is where we find a failure to meet requirements, so that's moderate level breaches that typically reflect poor administration of GLA contract information or poor development management or inadequate due diligence in property transactions, and those together with any minor breaches are noted in the overall comments. Serious failure to meet requirements is rated as red, so that's one or more severe breaches. Typically those breaches are cases where GLA investment has been put at risk or where grant has been claimed in advance of need, and those together with any moderate and minor breaches are noted overall in the comments and the rating. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the timetable that we're looking at this year, it's before we kind of get into the detail, I guess it's worth noting that we on all sides of this process, we do struggle with the demands placed upon us at the end of the financial year. So we are encouraging everyone to get ahead on compliance audit wherever possible. For example, if that involves booking in an earlier audit than in previous years. Again, we have allowed for virtual audit with the intention that this can help enable things to move along as smoothly and as quickly as possible. And we have extended, as noted, the period available to providers to prepare the audit files by sending the sample scheme to providers between 4 to 6 weeks prior to the audit date, which is a bit longer than previously. However, we have noticed in recent years an increase in the amount of slippage, particularly from auditors. So we are taking this opportunity to really reiterate that this has a huge impact on both the process and timelines for the audit overall, and can have that knock-on effect with things slipping into the final parts of the Q4, which is quite a challenging time, but also when there's delay from auditors, that can actually impact the rating that the partner's given overall because of how the audit has been administered, and does also run the risk of auditors losing their approved auditor status. So it is really important for everyone that we get these turned around on time in accordance with the timetable. So in terms of where we are now, RPs will know their sample size, and some have already appointed auditors and agreed visit dates, and where that's the case, those samples are now just beginning to get sent out to partners. So the key date at this point to really note is that the deadline for the issue of the auditor's report is the 16th of October. And then we request that auditors issue that simultaneously to the GLA and the partner at the same time. So auditors, when you send that report to the partner, please do copy in your GLA area manager at that same time, so there's no delays being caused there. Following that, the partner then has 2 weeks or 10 working days to send their version to the GLA, where they have input their responses and clarifications in response to the auditor's report, and they send that to us, and that must be with us no later than the 30th of October. Once we have received that report, we then begin the process of assessing and moderating all of the reports received from all providers for consistencies. So we consider any breaches that auditors have found, we review the evidence, and we take into account provider comments, and it may be that we come back asking for further evidence or clarifications as part of the moderation process that we as a group of compliance audit leads take to ensure the consistency of decision making across the whole of the GLA's portfolio. And we then aim to send out those reports with ratings and conclusions from us in January. Following that, providers then have until the 28th of February to review that and then get those reports signed off and return to us, confirming that any remedial actions have been undertaken where necessary. And then those remedial actions are noted and followed up regularly in the quarterly review meetings between partners and the GLA. So that's the timetable as it's currently looking. And yeah, let's all work as hard as we can to keep on track with that. If we can go to the next slide, please, Maria. Thank you. So in terms of the checklists, there are a number of checklists, and you will be aware that they form the basis for the audits, and with different checklists associated with the different programmes under which schemes are funded. So the auditor will run through the relevant checklists, looking for documentation to validate the data recorded on OPS. and it's really crucial at this point that the data that is on OPS is current and complete, as the auditor is likely to record a breach if an as-built scheme differs from what is actually on OPS. Different GLA funding programmes have different checklists. So this year there are 6. There are more RSAP schemes being audited this year, so do please be prepared for that. And in advance of next year, just be aware that we are in the process of putting together the checklist for community-led housing and the new 21-26 Affordable Homes programme in anticipation of delivery programmed for next year. So in general, we do recommend that providers familiarise themselves with the relevant checklists as well. They're not just for the use of auditors, as they act as a really helpful prompt to get the documentation in order to ensure that what you have on ops matches what's happened on the ground, and it will really help providers give the correct documentation to the auditor and help keep things running smoothly and on time according to the timetable. In terms of where to access these checklists, the Capital Funding Guide on the GLA website is the sort of source of all knowledge for this. If you go to section 9, I think it's section 9.6, that will have all the most up-to-date versions of all the checklists. So that's the place to access them, rather than sort of saved attachments that might have been circulating for unspecified periods of time and not necessarily be the most up-to-date. So do always access those checklists every year through the Capital Funding Guide. But if you do have any questions, do contact your GLA area manager, and I'm sure they will be more than happy to answer any queries. And yeah, the kind of 2 key things at this stage for providers to bear in mind, as mentioned, do make sure that auditors have read-only access, so there's no accidental editing of records, and also please make sure that all your projects that completed have been officially formally closed on OPS prior to us releasing the sample schemes. We can't release those samples until that's done, so please get on that, make sure that all of those have been closed on the system as soon as possible. That would be fantastic, and I will now hand over to Phoebe. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Becca. I'm now going to talk us through the templates. So just to have some headlines, GLA provides templates for all of the reports and a covering letter for the auditor's report. If we could just stress that we please do use these, they're standard documents and they simplify the process on our side and hopefully on provider's side as well. As you may have noticed, the initiation form has a slightly updated format to an Excel sheet this year. If you've got any questions about use, please do follow up with your area manager. The auditors, just to note, if you could update the GLA template and send a signed copy of your report, both in a PDF and Word version, when that's complete to your provider. The additional Word versions enables the client provider to add their comments and forward their commented version onto us at the GLA. And then just to flag for providers, please do use that 10 working day window to clarify any issues with the auditor if needed and address them in your report to the GLA, because this can really help to resolve those flagged issues early and then potentially speed up the process on our side. And we'd also like to offer encouragement to provide any missing documents that might be identified by the auditor during that period, because that means when it is submitted to us, we will have further evidence to review. And again, just to reiterate, if there are any questions, please do contact your area manager in the first instance. And if we just go on to the next slide, brilliant, thank you. This is the template for the compliance audit, which is unchanged materially from this year. This is the form to be used for all schemes, including RSAP, but not the cladding SSERF programme. So just on the steps then, so for the auditor, if the auditor could tick the auditor version checkbox and then complete the blue areas noted, then each block will have a B1 for each finding and numbered sequentially, B1, B2, B3, etc. And please do not start renumbering on the next scheme. So each scheme and each breach will have their own block. If there are no findings on this scheme, simply complete block 1 and enter none in auditor's finding. The next step is to sign and date section C, and then email a Word and PDF version of the report, an independent auditor report to the provider and the GLA at the same time by no later than 16th of October 2023. At this point, the lead provider will then check their yellow squared box in the Word version, review the auditor's finding and add comments as required, as well as any supporting evidence or details further. The next part is to then go to section D to sign and date, and then email both Word and PDF versions of the report to the GLA 10 days after receipt from the auditor, no later than 30th of October. And then here we have the final part where we have the GLA's bits to fill out. So we will complete those white boxes as part of the moderation process, and then we will add our signatures, and then we'll return those signatures to the provider, to the identified lead, chair or member, and that will go for signature in January. And if we go on to the next slide, I'll just quickly go through the SSERF cladding template, which is a simplified version of the standard template, and it excludes a procedural rating. This should be filled in separately for the cladding audit only. As before, the auditor should email both a Word and PDF version of the GLA report and independent auditor report to the provider and the GLA at the same time by no later than 16th of October 2023. And then the provider has 10 days to review, and then will likewise email both the Word and PDF completed versions by no later than 30th of October. And then here we have the comments section as well, where the GLA will fill out their comments and will return for signature by chair or lead member in January 2024. And then I'll just go on now to review the covering letter template. So this is not changed from previous years, and this is for the auditor to submit when they have their findings. For this one letter is fine per provider, so it can include both cladding and any other projects that would come into the audit year. I'm now going to hand over to Maria to refresh us on the rough sleeping accommodation or RSAP checklist.
Thanks, Phoebe. This is the second year of the RSAP audit, so we felt that it would be beneficial to have a quick refresh on the checklist. This is the second year of the SAP audit, so we felt that it would be beneficial to have a quick refresh on the checklist. The audit checklist for RSAP follows a similar format to the AHP audit checklist, with some amendments to reflect the differences in the schemes. So in general, the standards for evidence are aligned to the AHP standards for evidence. As noted by Becca earlier, there will be more RSAP schemes in this audit than in last year's. I now set out some notable differences in how the checklist is used. Typically, the AHP checklist would deal with both new build and purchases and repair units. All RSAP schemes are refurbishments except for modular build, so this is reflected within the document. In the text questions, going through these in numerical order, the first mirrors the AHP compliance audit requirements. The second is similar, but now has an additional few lines for consideration. The third question now has specific RSAP references for which the contract will need to be cross-referenced. The fourth, again, mirrors the AHP checklist, and the fifth question is similar, but has some amendment notes. Regarding question 6, please note that transitional schemes are not applicable to RSAP. Questions 7, 8, 11, and 14 mirror AHP compliance audit requirements. Question 9 and 10 have some additional descriptive lines. Question 12 amends AHP audit checklist for design standards to make it RSAP specific. Notes also amended. Question 15 refers to AHP checklist with additional requirements relating to service charges. Questions 16 and 17 are not applicable to RSAP, and then a new section has been added. These are questions 18 and 19. I'll now hand over to John to go through best practice examples.
Thanks very much, Maria, and morning everyone. I'm going to talk through a few examples from real audit reports that the GLA has considered over recent years, and as you will see as we work our way through the slides, some are better examples than others, but overall we think there are some useful lessons to be learned from looking at these real cases so that we can both improve on the quality of the audit reports that are produced by auditors. And if we go to the next, this is the first example which relates to the audit question 5, and it's in relation to planning conditions being signed off by the local planning authority prior to the final grant claim being submitted by the provider in ops. And you can see from this example, it's well set out. The auditors made a very concise and appropriate comment, and is very clear about which planning conditions have actually not been discharged by the local planning authority at final cost stage. So this is a good example. We haven't shown all of the actual conditions that weren't signed off, but it is a good example, and it's clear, and is very useful to both the provider and the GLA when it comes to our assessment of the individual finding. If we go to the next slide, I'll show you a different example which relates to the same question, and so it's still about planning conditions being signed off at final grant claim stage. And in this particular example, we can see the detailed comments from the auditor where they've specified that a certain number of planning conditions were outstanding at final cost stage, and which is, good, clear information for both the provider and the GLA. And you can also see here in the yellow highlighted cell the provider's comments in response to the auditor's findings. And it's a very detailed response, and it is actually quite lengthy because they've chosen to provide a lot of background information, and they want to set the context for why certain planning conditions were outstanding at the final grant claim stage. Now, this is useful information, but at the same time, we'd like our providers and auditors to try and keep their comments concise, succinct, and to the point, and relevant to the specific question that's been asked in the audit checklist. And you can see from this example that the provider's response actually is much longer than shown on this slide. If we go to the next slide, we can see the continuing story, as it were, as presented by the provider. And whilst we appreciate providers giving us lots of information to explain the history and the background to a particular finding by the auditor, it would be better if the provider could just try and be a bit more focused on the comments it provides, and try and be a bit more succinct and concise. There's a lot of information to take on board here for the GLA, and potentially it could delay our assessment of our final judgment and the finding rating for this specific question. And ultimately, in this instance, the provider was actually agreeing with the auditor's finding on this particular topic, and we can see from the provider's comments as well that as a result of that, they're already taking steps to ensure that they're taking the appropriate actions to ensure that this scenario or this type of scenario won't arise again. And it would also be beneficial if the auditor was to check the provider's scheme audit file to see if there had been any correspondence between the provider and the GLA, which kind of discussed this particular situation. And it is possible that the provider had already notified the GLA of some outstanding planning conditions, and that, if that was the case, then it's likely that this potentially could have been a non-breach in terms of the severity of the finding rating. So if we go to the next slide, here we have an example in relation to question 12, and it's about evidence that the completed scheme matches the design standards details submitted in OPS for this particular project. And you can see the provider's comments in the yellow highlighted cell, and they've made a reference to an old planning consent from quite a few years ago. However, in the GLA's view on this particular item, it was clear from looking at the details submitted in the OPS project record that the provider had indicated that it had met all the required design standards for that particular program. However, this is contrary to the auditor's finding, because they found that certain units didn't meet the GLA's design standards. Now, in this particular instance, this has resulted in an amber rating for this particular question. However, if the provider had properly reviewed the OPS project record when it was claiming the final grant payment or submitting the completion milestone achievement, then it could have actually addressed the issue at that point in time. It could have stated in the project record that not all of the design standards had been met by the project, and it could then have set out within OPS those particular aspects of the design standards which hadn't been met. Now, if the provider had gone through that process and submitted the project on that basis, then ultimately the GLA would have approved that project at final grant claim stage, and the matter would have been dealt with in the context of the audit report. The finding would effectively be a non-breach, because the provider had correctly notified the GLA that not all the design standards were met. And one other thing to note from this particular example is that because of this one finding in the audit report, it actually resulted in the overall rating for the entire audit report to also be amber, which reflects a failure to meet the GLA's requirements. And so that's just one example of how significant these particular issues can be. If we go to the next slide. And this is another example in relation to question 13, and the unit details entered into OPS on a project. And this is quite a common occurrence that we see in many audit reports, and it's where the unit rent details entered in ops are actually quite different to the actual rents and service charges as shown in the tenancy agreements for the completed dwellings at first letting stage. And one thing that we like to remind auditors of is that when they do present this information to us, we do like to see the details of what kind of variation there is in the rent data or the service charge data that's been entered into ops. And it is helpful to us to see what those percentage variances are on a unit by unit basis. The reason why this information is important is because the level of percentage variance will dictate ultimately what the severity level of the breach is. So in this instance, it was deemed to be an overall low percentage variance, and therefore it's been given a low level rating for this finding. If there was a variance of in excess of 10% to 20% or thereabouts, then that could be considered a medium level breach and an amber rating. And then if it's higher than 20%, then potentially that could be a serious failing and a red rating. So it is important for us to see what those variances are, and that's just a reminder to auditors to present that level of detail. If we go to the next example, we've got a different question, but again, it's question 14, and it's about the unit details entered into ops and what has been approved in the project in ops and what has actually been delivered by the as-built scheme at practical completion stage. And we've got a couple of examples here. The one on the left, I mean, it does provide us with relevant information from the auditor about the fact that there are differences between the original approval and the scheme delivered at final cost stage. But it's not immediately obvious where the differences lie in terms of the unit size mix delivered on this scheme. On the right hand side of the slide, you can see a much better presentation of the differences between the original ops approved project and the as-built scheme. And one thing we would comment on is that what would also be helpful in this instance is if in the table on the right, the auditor had presented another column to show the actual variance percentage for the different unit size types, because again, that will influence the severity rating of any breach identified. So that's just one other example of how we think the information could be presented by the auditor to make it clearer for both the provider and the GLA, and to make our assessments that much easier. If we go to the next slide, again, we have another example which relates to question 15 this time, but again, it's to do with the unit details entered into ops and the differences in the rents in this particular instance. And you can see the example that we've shown you on the left hand side, which is a very brief comment from the auditor, setting out that there is a difference and there are these figures in ops, and there are different figures on the provider scheme audit file, and there's no kind of reference there to the percentage difference between those figures, but also you know, it's just a very brief comment, and there's no kind of, in this particular instance, I don't think there was any kind of useful comment provided by the provider in support of that particular variation. Now, the example we're showing you here on the right is much better presented, and you can see that the auditor set it out very clearly about a number of specific units that they checked, and it's clearly showing the ops rent and the actual rents as per the tenancy agreement, and then we can clearly see on the right hand side the difference in those figures. And having said that this is really clear and well presented, it would also be better if the auditor had in fact had an additional column on the right hand side to show the percentage variance between the ops rent and the actual rent. And as I've mentioned already, that percentage variance is critical really when we assess the overall position on this particular finding, and it will influence the breach severity rating that we ultimately decide to award to this particular item. So it is important for auditors and providers to be as clear as possible when presenting the information to us. If we go to the next example, this is one example of, again, a finding that's not untypical for us to see in the audit report, and it relates to question 8, and it's about claiming the grant at start on site milestone stage. And you can see from this instance that the GLA has awarded a high level breach to this particular item on this specific scheme, and these are the kind of GLA conclusion comments from having assessed the particular finding from the auditor. And in this particular case, the provider did acknowledge and accept that on this project they had claimed the start on site grant in advance of need, and wherever that happens, as we've mentioned previously, that's a high level breach. It's very serious, and it could ultimately lead to the overall rating for the whole audit report to be considered red and a serious failure to meet the GLA's requirements. Now, in this particular instance, the provider had claimed the start on site grant in December 2020, and that was clearly evident from the data appearing in ops for the project, and it was through the audit report itself that it was found that the provider had only entered into the main build contract in January 2021. So the main build contract had been signed and dated over a month after the provider had claimed the start on site grant in ops on this scheme. So that's a serious finding, and we are constantly reminding our partners to ensure that they make themselves fully aware of the specific questions contained within the audit checklists before they actually set about claiming grant payments through the project record in ops, and that applies equally to claiming grants at completion stage, as well as start on site stage. So just a reminder of how important it is for providers in particular to liaise very closely with their GLA area manager if they are in any doubt as to whether they're properly complying with the grant agreement that they've signed with us and the requirements set out in the GLA's capital funding guide. And it's clear within those two documents where and when providers are able to claim the start on site grant or the completion grant. So that concludes the kind of the real examples that we wanted to show you today, and I'll hand back now to Phoebe.
Thanks, John. And just to reiterate then what John was saying there, on the capital funding guide, section 9 of our capital funding guide is just on the compliance audit and the information required to complete it. We can find all of the documents that we've mentioned in this briefing under section 9.6 of the capital funding guide. So that includes the initiation form, covering letter for auditor's report, template for auditor's report, the template for the SSCRF cladding report, and might be of use the which checklist document, which has each programme and then the checklist that it relates to. And you can also find under 9.6 all of the checklists. And then just to say, we're moving on to the next slide, just the final one, just to say if you've got any questions, please either follow up with your area manager directly, or you can put a question to the AffordableHomes@london.gov.uk email for the attention of the compliance audit team, and we can also get back to you that way. Thanks everyone for your time today. Look forward to hearing from you soon.